Right. So looking at the menu project here and looking at starting to finalize the different assets, remember that the menu project is really intended for you to begin putting into practice several of the exercises that we've completed within the course so far. So one of those main strategies that we want to think about is the actual composition and organization of the information. And in order to provide that, we need to be using elements of alignment based off of either guidelines that you're bringing into the space or some sort of grid structure that you're bringing into the space. And depending on the format that you're using, it may, lend itself more towards an actual grid. If you're using maybe a front and back, or if you're using the sort of bifold, you might want to be utilizing some sort of guidelines within the space. Either way, we're looking for some sort of places where things are going to align and there's consistency within the actual space, right? And not only are we looking for that sense of alignment, but we're also looking at proximity here. We want to group things together. And this is very typical to a menu experience, right? When we go into a restaurant, when we're looking at menus, we tend to look for things grouped together. If there's appetizers or small plates, those are typically going to be grouped together in one section. If there's, for example, some sort of entrees or desserts, those are also going to be grouped together. And there's also a certain sort of flow that typically happens within menus as well. You typically have something that you might start with within your meal, such as appetizers, small plates. Then you might move on to your main courses. You might have drinks if you wanted to include something like that within your menu, or some sort of desserts, which I don't think was actually offered in the text, but of course you could add to it, include that within your menu as well. All of these things have a sort of given format to them already. So we can utilize this within our own menu projects and utilize our own experience of how we've viewed menus and things like that within the past. And again, to do this effectively, we want to make sure that we are utilizing alignment and we're also utilizing those different styles to create that consistency within the space. So this is an example of a previous students from last semester here. And we can see that they are utilizing the menu content in a really effective way. And there's a couple things to pay attention here. One thing to pay attention to here is the background color of this menu. Okay, they're utilizing a white background, which I know sometimes is hard to use in the very beginning because it feels like you want to start adding some color into the space and utilizing, larger amounts of color. But when you're dealing with a lot of text, often it's best to use some sort of neutral background like this. And you don't have to use a white background necessarily, but I would suggest that you use some sort of neutral color for your background, whether that is a lighter neutral color or a darker neutral color. That will allow you to create more of that contrast within the space. And if you're struggling with this at all, or you feel like you're not really sure, it's always safe to go white or some variation of a white or neutral tone there, right? So that's one thing I would suggest working with within this menu is some sort of lighter background, potentially, maybe even white, just to sort of, be able to contrast all of those different elements. Next, if we're looking at this within the sense of this sort of bifold structure, not necessarily a front and back of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, but more of that sort of folded 8.5 by 11 style. Let me pull a sheet here. Oops. So basically, we're looking at this being on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, right? Printed on front and back. But in this particular instance here, this is set up as sort of a bifold, right? Meaning this is going to be sort of folded along the vertical here. The outside, which we're looking at over here, which has the La Cucina Romano on it, this section here, would be the front of the menu. The other side on the left over here would actually be the back of the menu. Okay, so you'd be presented with that such as this. You would have your front of the menu, the back of the menu, and then you would open that up, like we can see on page 2, to actually show the content of what's displayed inside. So that being said, if you are using this bifold style, which is one we're going to look at today in InDesign, you want to make sure that you're treating the front of the menu one way and the back of the menu the other way. And you also want to make sure that none of your information is flowing in between your gutter here in the very center, right? Because then that information would kind of get lost when it's being read inside that gutter. So just as we can see here, they're creating this clear separation here between these two columns of information here and of the actual items within the menu. And that is used to have that fold, to have all that information clear of one another. And of course, still having this left alignment to all of these different elements within the space as well. Another thing to take a look at is the way that they are contrasting typefaces and styles of the typefaces here as well. Now, a good way to do this is to use some sort of color that you're bringing in from your branding template, right, to complement the space potentially. Another way to do this is to use the different scale of typefaces that you have, larger and smaller, using capitals and lowercase versions of those, and also italic and condensed, the different options and styles that you have within the typefaces as well. So all of these can be used to create separation within the space. And we can see that being done really effectively here. We can see this for the table, which kind of sets you off for what this whole category is going to be about. And then we can clearly see each one of these dishes is in full capital letters here, which gives you the price next to it in a slightly different style. And then below that, we have a smaller version of that text that's in capital and lowercase that's giving you the description of this, okay? So for the description of your dish, more than likely, I would suggest using capital and lowercase for that. If you're going to use all capitals, I would stick with either the name of your dish and or the section of the menu to utilize those all capitals. But when you're starting to get into more descriptive qualities and you have some longer lengths of sentences, when you use all capital letter forms, it actually gets harder to read that text. So using uppercase and lowercase allows for an easier read. So looking at some of the things that are going on here, there's some very successful elements that you guys can pull within your own space as well. The element of alignment and essentially contrast within these different elements. And we can go back to this grid structure, right? Not everybody's going to have such a complicated grid structure in this particular assignment, but essentially we're still working from some sort of columns within the space, which are going to be those vertical areas that move within the actual layout. And we want to have some sort of margins within the space as well. You do not want your information to go all the way up to the outside of that page. You always want to have some clear margin area that's going to create that live area at the center of your page for the content of your menu. So make sure that you're providing a clear space all around the edge. And going back to that grids and modularity, we can see how we can build off of that structure, right? The modularity within the different grid structure can create unique compositions utilizing a single grid structure and different spatial zones within those different modules and structural qualities. So just because we're building up these guidelines and these columns and so forth, doesn't mean everything needs to sit exactly within there. We can create these larger spatial zones, but we're simply relying on these guidelines and grids to place the different elements to create that alignment and organization within the space. And we can see how we can do this with guidelines too. It doesn't have to be as complicated as a full grid structure. Simply implying a single guideline within the space and having all of that information aligned to that can create that organization that we're going for. So depending on how you guys are working within your format, make sure that you guys are aligning those elements. The other thing here is considering your fonts, right? We talked about this last week a little bit, and you started to research some typefaces that you could potentially use for the menu. Remember that we have quite a bit of content here, so we should be able to span these different levels of hierarchy. So choose a typeface that is simple, that will work for some larger areas of text or body, some of the descriptions of the plates, along with the headlines and subheaders. And then you can always choose some other style of font that might be a little bit more decorative for the actual word mark or for the actual category, so on and so forth. But the font you use for that body copy, the smaller area of text within your menu, it should be unobtrusive. You want to save those more decorative, show off sort of fonts for things like headlines and other elements that require that emphasis, okay? Also think about contrasting your text. This is something that I did notice within some of the branding templates that were coming through, as well as some of the options of the menus that had been uploaded already, where that some of the typefaces felt a little similar to one another as far as the typefaces that were chosen for the assignment. You want to make sure that we are working with completely different styles of typefaces that's going to show contrast within the space. If we are working with two that are very similar, like two serifs or two very similar sans serifs, for example, there's really not that much contrast within the space. You're better off just relying on one single typeface and utilizing different styles within that typeface. When we're introducing new typefaces or new fonts into the actual project, we want to make sure that there's a reason for that, and that should show a large amount of contrast. So if you're choosing a sans serif typeface, then maybe you want to choose a serif to contrast that. Or if you're choosing a script, maybe you want to choose a slab serif or a more modern style serif, like a Dido serif, like we can see here, that has that extreme thick and thin to it. The more contrast you have between the typefaces, the more you're going to be able to establish that hierarchy within the space. So if you don't feel like there's a strong enough contrast between your typefaces, go back and choose a different one. Stick with one and then go back and choose a different variation from something else to allow for more contrast within there. And within those typefaces, remember, think about the different options and the styles and the ways that you can use these, and make sure that you are choosing something that's going to be versatile enough for all of these, right? You want to make sure that you're going to choose something that you're going to be able to use for a header style font, which might be somewhere between 48 points, right? And it's usually going to be more bold or heavy version of that font, like we can see over here on the left. You can see in the center here an Avenir Next, which is the same typeface, just in a different variation and a different size, which creates more of that subheader style. And then all the way on the right, we can see this 14 point set at regular with a little bit of a tighter leading there as well, tighter spacing between the sentences that creates more of that body copy. So one single typeface can span all of these different weights and sizes to create that hierarchy within the space. And utilizing that along with a very contrasting typeface to go along with it as well, you can create, a lot of different variation within there. So make sure that you are looking for those contrasting elements. Serifs and sans serifs, scripts and slab serifs, for example, monotype and a sans serif, whatever it may be, look for those different variations and contrast within the space. The next thing we want to look at here is some of the type setting options that we have. So one of the important things we can look at here is the actual kerning and the tracking between the individual letters of the actual word or sentences. This is used to create that different distance between the individual letters within the word that we're looking at. So that is considered our kerning there, the spacing between the two individual letters between words. This isn't going to be so important within your body copy, but when you're using some larger text for, say, your word mark for the actual menu, you want to consider that spacing between each one of these letter forms, because each one of those letter forms is going to be very large and create a lot of emphasis within the space. So that curation of that spacing needs to be taken into consideration a little bit more as well. So that's in reference to the kerning, the spacing between two individual letter forms, right? And beyond that, we have tracking. And this is actually the spacing between all the different letters in the body of text. So this is going to space out how far each one of these letters is spaced out from the previous letter. So not just necessarily two letter forms, but all the letters within a larger body of text. And this will highly decide how long your text box is going to be as well. If you have a wide tracking within your body copy, it's going to be a much longer body of text than if it has a shorter tracking. So something to consider, you might want to stretch out the tracking in certain portions of the menu to create more emphasis within that text. The other thing to consider is the leading. And this is the space between your baseline, or essentially your line spacing, right? This means that when we manipulate the leading, we change the way the paragraph looks and how long and how short that paragraph is going to be. When we have tighter leading, those sentences are going to be closer together. They're not going to take up as much space, but they can be a little bit more difficult to read because that is a little bit more dense, right? So oftentimes when we are trying to make something a little easier for somebody to read or navigate, we open up the leading. We create more space between those lines of text to make it a little bit easier for the viewer to read and to digest that information. In doing so, of course, we're also taking up more actual space. So it's something to consider there as well. But between your tracking and your leading, these are going to be two major tools that you use within your text formatting to create the difference of hierarchy that you have within the space. Before I move on from that, are there any questions? These are two very important things. The kerning is important as well. That's between the two different letter forms. But really, when you're dealing with larger bodies of copy, the tracking, the spacing between all those letters and the actual leading is very important to be able to establish in that text formatting. Is there any questions on that right now before I move on? We'll take a look at how to manipulate that and remind ourselves, but to make sure everybody feels comfortable with that. So moving on from those text formatting styles a little bit, why do we need to look at these? Well, while we're setting all of these things up, such as the kerning such as the tracking and or the leading and the actual size of the typeface and the style of that typeface, all of these can be applied towards these styles that we use within InDesign, right? Paragraph styles and character styles. Yeah, absolutely, Christine. We'll take a look at that here shortly. So being able to utilize those different tools allows you to be able to set up these different styles that you can apply within the different content of, in this case, our menu or in any layout that you might be working with. So a paragraph style includes both the character and paragraph formatting attributes, and it can be applied to a paragraph or a range of paragraphs, meaning multiple paragraphs together. So paragraph styles and character styles are found on separate panels. And again, the biggest difference here between the paragraph styles and the character styles is that paragraph affects the entire paragraph, meaning not only that specific character, but the actual formatting attributes that have to do with that whole paragraph as well. And when we look at these paragraph style options, we see something like this here, where we have this sort of general breakdown of what that is, as a paragraph style. Then we also have the character formats, which tells us what the size of that format is, size of that font is, the style of it, so on and so forth. And then you get into different options here as well, such as hyphenation, indents, and spacing. Any of these attributes that you set for this paragraph style can then be uploaded to any other elements within the document there. And you can see how this would be super, super helpful for something that would have a lot of information and a lot of content. If you're working with a magazine, for example, that has 100 pages, you don't want to go through and have to set every single one of those elements of text and the leading differently, right? Because if you were, then it opens up a lot more opportunity for something to go wrong, for there to be inconsistencies, and obviously it's a lot more time consuming. So setting these up correctly in the very beginning will help with your workflow. And you've actually probably been using these for a long time, really, without really knowing it. How many of you guys have seen something like this in some sort of application that you've used in the past, where you have set some sort of formatting to some text that you might have worked with, whether it was in InDesign or Word, Microsoft Word or something? Show of hands. I see a Lone Jar giving me a thumbs up over there. Christine shaking her head yes as well. Yeah, I mean, this is something that we see even within our emails, right? Where we have these different sort of structures that we can choose from within the text and the formatting styles. And essentially, this is the same thing. These are styles that have been preset that we can choose from. And what we're doing in InDesign is we're just setting up our own. So we're essentially customizing that to be able to apply towards the different elements there. So when we're working with those paragraph styles, we're going to have these different windows that are open, the paragraph styles window, and that will also open up your character styles window. And within our paragraph styles window, as we add more paragraph styles with the plus icon here, we will see those, start to pop up and populate within our actual window here. And we can label those. We can see heading level 1, heading level 2, intro paragraph. Each one of these can then be changed to have a different size, different color. Any attributes that you would apply to this will then be saved to everything that has that paragraph style applied to it, right? So this is kind of how we can go through and build that actual menu once we have started to set up those paragraph styles. The other thing that we want to look at is character styles, which is slightly different. It really isolates more of an individual character within the text versus an entire paragraph, okay? So instead of looking at an entire paragraph and formatting that, we're actually giving a stylization to just specific characters within that paragraph. And that's really the biggest difference. It allows you to save and reuse specific style formatting, such as a font, face, or a color, and using a character styles allows you to customize that within specific text of a paragraph. Because obviously, if you have a paragraph style applied to everything within that paragraph, it's going to try to do it consistently. So you would need to go in and create a character style that might sit within that paragraph. So that being said, for example, here, we might have a larger paragraph style, right? That has a certain size, a certain leading, tracking to it, what have you. This would be considered the paragraph style. Now, looking at this capital letter T, the sort of drop cap that you would be using for this paragraph here, this would be a character style that you would apply within the paragraph style, because it is still within that paragraph. It is just a single character and or multiple characters that are being manipulated a little bit differently than the rest of that paragraph. Okay, so you can see how these two work hand in hand. Paragraph styles essentially formats the entirety of that paragraph and everything that's included in there. Character styles applies just to single characters within that paragraph or paragraph style. And you can see how these two windows will essentially mimic that, and you can create those different styles and utilize those by selecting them within the space. You guys have any questions on the character or paragraph styles right now? Any trouble that anybody had maybe setting those up this week? We'll take a look at and review those again today, but let's see if anybody had any questions. This was something else that we took a look at last week, with these hidden characters within our text, right? When we are working with InDesign and we are working with text formatting, we want to make sure that we are using our hidden characters and making those visible within the space. And this gives us cues within our text formatting as far as how this text is set up within the document and what we can do to sort of change that and to clean that up a little bit. And we're going to get into this a little bit more once we get into the magazine project and look at some better practices for that. But I do want you to start to look at these different icons. You don't have to memorize all of these right now, but some things that you do want to be aware of are the well, first off, looking at how these look, right? When we turn on our hidden characters and we're looking at some body of text, we can see that all these little blue hidden characters sort of pop up within this space. And again, this is giving us information about how this is set up within our document. So this sort of paragraph return, or this sort of backwards P, is letting us know that that is a hard return, right? That is letting us know that we're creating a new paragraph within that space. Below that, we see that forced line break. And that's what we were referring to last week, is that soft return, where if you don't want to create a whole new paragraph, you just want that line to be forced to the next line, then you can use the shift key and your return or enter button to have that line of text move down without having to create a new paragraph, which would interrupt your paragraph styles. There's also the single dot here, which would be your anytime you have a space in between the different words. So if you have two of those dots, you'll know that there's an extra space within there. You have the different tab icons, which are these two sort of arrows that are moving over to the right, which lets you know that there's a tab within the space. And then the last one is the end of story, which will be that sort of hashtag logo that lets you know that that's the end of the actual text within that document. Now, of course, there's more of those here that you can check out, but these are some of the more important ones that are going to be more common within your bodies of text here. And we can utilize these because if we know that if we have hard returns or these paragraph returns, that's where those paragraph styles are going to start and stop, essentially, right? And we can also use those to sort of clean up some of our space a little bit. Ideally, when you are working within some sort of text, you don't necessarily want to have unused hidden characters. So for example, right here, we can see that there's 3 paragraph returns that are very small, right? For whatever reason, they've hit the return key 3 different times and the leading is really tight in between there. They're trying to create that spacing from one paragraph to the next, but that is inconsistent with how you would do that throughout an entire document. Instead of using 3 paragraph returns there, you'd actually want to use no returns and simply set the leading of this top sentence to be a little bit further away, maybe being a first sentence to your actual paragraph there. So you want to try to get rid of any hidden characters that are not necessary, okay? And this also lets you gives you cues as far as the text formatting. Bulleted lists created with tabs over here that we can see, right? Or 2 different types of white spaces that are being used over here, where they're creating 2 different spaces. So it allows us to view some sort of errors that we might overlook. And when we are producing a lot of content for something that potentially is going to be printed for thousands and thousands of dollars, you want to make sure that you're going through and finding any of those corrections beforehand. So that's why it's very helpful to look for these hidden characters. And we will utilize these a little bit more as we get into our magazine project for our final project in the semester. But we want to start to think about those and how we can utilize those within the space. So looking at the example that we had from the class here a little bit further, I just want to look at one kind of particular section here, because again, there is some things that are being used well, because what we can see is we have some clear hierarchy among the different categories, meaning greens here, right? That is in a different typeface, a different color. It's in all capitals. It's a sort of bolder version of this slab serif typeface. And then we get into more of this Daido style. Actually, maybe it's more of a traditional style serif that we can see there. Again, utilizing all capital letter forms for the actual name of the dish, and then putting the price for that in some distinct brackets over here, right? They're also utilizing an additional space in between here. There's maybe 2 to 3 space bars that are being used here before the price. So instead of just using that single space, they're doubling that up or potentially using a tab there that brings it over a little bit further as well. And then coming into the actual description of the dish, again, they're utilizing uppercase and lowercase letter forms, allowing you to read that a little bit easier. They're making sure that the actual leading here for this is clear and not overlapping within one another. And there's a little bit larger leading that's happening between the actual dishes that are being shown and the actual description of the dishes inside here. So each one of these components has a different setup. It has a different paragraph and or character style that's being used here. And we can actually see these being highlighted here. Each one of these areas highlighted in the blue is an actual paragraph style, right? We have our sort of header up here, which gives us certain attributes of being that typeface, all capitals in this color at that size. Then we have our actual dish, which again gives us those attributes in a different character style, paragraph style. Then we have the description, which would be an additional paragraph style. And then we have this red box over here, which would actually be a character style within there potentially, right? Because it is maybe being shown a little bit different as an italic version or a bold version of that. So we have all these different paragraphs, and then within those different paragraphs, we can utilize those character styles as well to separate that information, create that hierarchy within the space, and start to explore how we can organize this information a little bit easier. That's really what I want you guys to do here this week, is Now that we've started to finalize the actual assets for what's going to be included for the word mark and the colors and typefaces, I want to make sure that you are utilizing a clear use of space, utilizing a light colored background, contrasting typefaces on top of that background that are going to be contrasting of one another and also within the colors being used. Potentially graphic elements like we can see here within these sort of line segments that are coming into the space, or even these sort of dots and things like that that add a little bit of uh, interest. And then even looking at the alignment here, right? We have a center alignment for the actual titles of these sections. We have left alignment for the majority of dishes. They're actually utilizing 2 columns here for the suits because of them being a little bit shorter titles and not wanting to span that much information. So there's a strong hierarchy within the use of the information being used here, and a clear differentiation between the proximity and the different sections of the menu. So spend some time on the typesetting with the attention to the detail here. We want to look for any inconsistencies within the actual text, any hyphens within the text. We want to try to bring those words down to the next line. We also want to try to avoid any widows, which are going to be words by themselves on a line. So trying to organize that type structure, working within a grid or some sort of guidelines, and then thinking about character and paragraph styles to create a strong hierarchy and unity within the menu. So utilizing the scale, the alignment, the type style, and other cues to bring that visual order to the content provided. And again, keep it clean, keep it simple. This is really a practice for type formatting here for text. Don't try to get too carried away with the actual design elements. We will have the opportunity to do that within the next project here of the magazine, a lot more. I would really try to focus on the text here and let that do the talking.